Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Roki Fukuzawa, and I am privileged to be the chair of this year's Conference of Metallurgists. I am delighted to welcome you here to participate and share your knowledge and network in our 62nd Annual Conference of Metallurgists, or COM 2023, in my hometown of Toronto. We acknowledge the land we're meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Before we begin, just a very quick safety share. So we know that we're hoping that COVID is certainly behind us. Well, many of us hope so. But we do want to remind people that there are various transmissible diseases still around, and including COVID. And as we're gathering in large numbers in person, which is great, just be mindful and keep in mind washing hands, good hygiene practices, and also be mindful of different, everyone may have different comfort levels with certain in-person activities. Also, should an emergency arise, please take note of the emergency signs and follow the hotel instructions. Please also make sure to wear your badge at all times for access to the conference events, as we're removing paper tickets. So your badge will be scanned for entry to the various functions of the conference. So it is great to see so many familiar faces and new faces here, and that reminds us all just how important it is for us to network in person and share our technical knowledge face-to-face. The Metallurgy and Materials Society, which is METSOC, of CIM, is committed to serving our members, society, and others involved in the research, development, and application of the science and technologies for the sustainable extraction, fabrication, utilization, and recycling of metals and materials. And today, I also want to highlight our new Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, in short, it is EDI, standing committee within METSOC. METSOC recognizes the importance of acting on equity, diversity, and inclusion, and these values are integral to the respectful treatment of people from all parts of our community. And we need to actively lead and act on these values through conscious engagement. And you can find more information on our EDI Standing Committee on our website. The EDI Committee also publishes monthly newsletters, and today I want to just feature an example of the August newsletter, which you may find interesting and applicable to a conference setting. The topic of the August newsletter is on unconscious cognitive biases. Specifically was on its negative impact on hiring, however, thinking that we're at a conference setting and we're meeting a lot of new people, that may be applicable here as well. So unconscious cognitive biases are mental shortcuts consisting of assumptions, attitudes, beliefs, and stereotypes. Involuntarily, they occur when people have to interpret and deal with information. So some of these key features to note are these biases are, everyone has them. We can hold them against our own community, our own group. They can be activated within a fraction of a second, so that's why it's unconscious. And they're also persistent, but can be changed with attention and work. Certainly, you can imagine how that may apply in a recruitment setting. And we want to remind, we want to feature that, simply being aware of this bias is not enough, and there are more systemic training processes, such as breaking the bias habit, and a lot of other training materials are available and that are shown to reduce the negative biases effects. They're difficult to avoid and difficult to correct, and no one is immune to them. So we want to use these strategies and first of all be aware of them, but also actively use strategies to limit the influence of these cognitive biases, in a conference setting, I hope, and also eventually in our workplace and in our daily lives. And finally, executive leadership is seen as a critical factor to change corporate culture and association culture, and to address biases by creating a safer space for everyone. So again, thank you for joining this year for the conference theme of climate change and sustainability. We have 4 exciting plenary sessions of keynote speakers and curated panel discussions, which we'll introduce them shortly. We also have 6 technical symposia organized by METSOC's technical sections. And I encourage you to take advantage of as many talks as you can. I know that will be difficult. 3 of these technical symposia are also honoring members who have left an important mark in our field. Derek Kirkfoot, Andre LaPlante, Janice Lakowski, and Dr. Bert Wasman, whom I had the privilege to know as a mentor and work with during my career at Hatch. During our reception later, we will show a few slides of those who are being honored this week. We have an exciting conference ready for you, and prepare yourself to be challenged, excited, and inspired during the next few days, and enjoy meeting old and new colleagues. And next, I would like to welcome to the stage the conference technical chair, Sina Masago from SNC-Lavalin, to acknowledge the committees.
Hello, everyone, and I would like to once again welcome all of you to COM 2023, and hope that the conference provides the most informative and productive experience for you this year. Before we begin, I just wanted to highlight that the conference could not have been organized without support of a number of volunteers and tireless effort of them over this past few months, particularly. So I would, before we start, I would like to call them on the podium so that you can recognize them, starting with our organizing committee. Our secretary, Dimitrios Filippo from Rio Tinto, if he's in the room. Please. Our sponsorship chair, Niels Warman from Hatch. Please. Thank you. Our industrial tour chair, Lauren Jakubowski from Hatch. Our student chair, Sydney Omalon from McGill. And our big idea leader, Nathan Stubina from Sherit. I would also like to call our symposium chairs who have helped us over the past 2 years, actually, to organize the symposia. So starting from Advanced Manufacturing and Materials Symposium, Zhao Feng Lin from National Research Council of Canada. Please come up. Please come up. Derek Kerfoot, Memorial Pressure Hydrometallurgy Symposium, Brad Hewitt from Hatch. Light Metals and Transportation and Next Generation Vehicle Symposium, Abdullah Al-Sayed, University of Gulf, please. De La Plante-Laskowski Symposium on Mineral Processing Fundamentals. We have Charlotte Gibson from Queen's University as chair, but unfortunately she's not here. So Jean-François Boulanger from Université de Québec, Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Sustainability Integration for Better Outcomes Symposium. We have Brittany McKinnon from Hatch and Christopher Pickles from Queen's University. And from Wasmund Memorial Symposium of Sustainability in Pyrometallurgy, my co-chair Elmira Musavi from ETS. So once again, we sincerely thank their contributions over the past few months. And now the conference chair can come back and introduce our next plenary speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So before we move to our plenary, we must acknowledge the support we have of the leaders in the industry, and not only with allowing their employees time to devote to MedSoc, like myself, but also with the generous financial sponsorship that they provide to COM as well as MedSoc. So we have listed all our sponsors here, and special thanks to our premier sponsors, Hatch and Sherritt, and all the others listed here for making this happen. So thank you all who have contributed, who are vital in giving MedSoc the ability to offer the community technical content and new research in this conference. So next, I would like to introduce our first plenary speakers. To begin our conference, I would like to invite to the stage Dr. Sam Marcuson. Sam is currently an adjunct professor at University of Toronto, collaborating with personnel in the Sustainable Materials Research Laboratory. From 1980 to 2013, he worked at Vale Canada and its predecessor company, Inco Limited, retiring as Vice President, Base Metals Technology Development. He is a past president of the Metallurgy and Materials Society of CIM, a fellow of the CIM, and the 2018 recipient of the MedSoc Area Award. Sam will be talking about the metal production and the environment plus 50. I would also like to introduce our second speaker, as they will be having a joint plenary session. Our second speaker is Dr. Peter Warrian. Dr. Peter Warrian is a distinguished research fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. He was formerly research director of the United Steelworkers of America and chief economist of the province of Ontario. He is Canada's leading academic expert on the steel industry. His current research is on digital technologies and supply chains in the mining industry, and he'll be talking about looking at the economic assumptions underlying Commoner's 4 laws of ecology. So, welcome.
Thank you for the nice introduction. We want to avoid getting in the way of food and drink, so we'll get right into it. Okay, let's see. Oh, there it is. Sorry. Okay, in 1973, I was a graduate student at Columbia University, and I took the first edition of Herbert Kellogg's course, Metals, Production, and the Environment. Kellogg was a leading pyrometallurgist of the 20th century and became a leading advocate for energy and environmental conservation in process metallurgy. This course affected me positively. I've kept my course notes and my term project ever since. Last fall, it occurred to me that it's been 50 years since this course. And since Kellogg was a leader in this field, it would be interesting to connect the past with the present and compare what we were taught with what actually happened, hence this presentation. So here was a course description. It was a traditional course in descriptive process metallurgy, but with emphasis on environment, earth, and recycling. It was a popular course. We had lively debates, especially about commodity shortages, with the geologists arguing that the world is big and there were no shortages, and the process people falling in line with the professor saying that this is a real possibility. Now, Kellogg was at the forefront of energy calculations, both in use, efficiency, and accounting. There were no standards of energy accounting at the time. Variations in reporting, possibly biased by an organization's or an individual's objectives were present, and in some cases they were just wrong. Kellogg developed the methodologies that are employed in life cycle analysis today. We also had a different view on energy in those days than today. For example, direct use of fossil fuel was the most efficient source for heating purposes. Natural gas was viewed as a premium fuel for clean applications. Coal actually delivered more of its energy, its chemical energy, to heat than the other fossil fuels, and was actually desirable as long as it was used in a dirty application that the gases and the material would have to be cleaned anyway. Electricity was generated from fossil fuels in the United States and elsewhere at about a 32% efficiency, and therefore was inefficient from an energy conservation point of view, and should only be used where required by metallurgical concerns. So let's give just take a little view of what we're going to talk about. We're going to set the context by talking about the USA in 1970. Then we're going to talk about two environmental Bibles of the time that played a role in the course, Limits to Growth and The Closing Circle. We'll talk about Barry Commoner's concepts of social thrift. We'll have a very brief discussion on recycling, and then comments and conclusions. So, in 1970, the USA was the undisputed economic leader of the world. 31% of the world's GDP came from the US, 12% from Russia. Japan was just starting to rise, it only contributed 6%, and China still undeveloped 2%. However, there were many social divides in the United States: the war in Vietnam, student unrest, race, sex, and drugs. And the industry faced an uncertain future: workers' rights, environment, and energy. Now, people actually believed that governments could make a difference. And these landmark legislations protecting the workers and the environment and trying to improve the use of mining and minerals were actually passed in this period and signed into law by Richard Nixon. People viewed economic growth as the bogeyman, if we will, of resource exploitation and manufacturing existential threats. There were many opinions on how to deal with this to get rid of this existential threat. If you're interested in this topic, I suggest you read this book, Toward a Steady State Economy, edited by Herman Daly. And you will find essays on different dimensions of creating a steady state economy, including the constraints on the economy and the ecology, social adjustments and ethics, and theological considerations about obtaining a steady state economy. Now, let's shift to the Limits to Growth, which was a controversial environmental Bible. Sponsored by the Club of Rome, which is an informal group of people concerned about the future of the earth and the future of humankind, the study was a computer model of the world's economy, which was created by the Systems Dynamics Group of MIT, an organization that is very active today. Their model incorporated feedback loops between trends of global concern, for example, rapid population growth and deteriorating environment. Their models could be used to create different scenarios in which one or multiple parameters were changed and the impact on the global economy quantified. The business as usual scenario replicated here. So this is the way we're doing business today. This is what will happen if we continue into the future. Predicted economic collapse in the 21st century. It could be a controlled collapse or it could be a catastrophic collapse. And if you look at this graph, you can see the collapse illustrated by a drop in population because people were starving or dying, a decrease in resource exploitation, a decrease in industrial activity, and as a result, a decrease in pollution. When the researchers changed one parameter at a time, for example, doubling resource availability, it had little impact. Collapse was merely developed. These results were shocking at the time. The researchers could predict a stable world economy, which I've illustrated on the right, but only by changing all the parameters shown below. For example, stabilizing the world's population, having net zero capital investments, reducing resource consumption to 1/4 of that on a per capita basis of 1970. Critics of the study argued that the program was not transparent, the assumptions could not be determined, and thus the predictions were unreliable. Nonetheless, the study gained lots of traction and influenced a generation of students who learned about resource utilization, the environmental impact, and exponential growth. Since those times, a number of follow-up volumes have been published, and the authors still argue that the essence of their study is legitimate. So now we'll talk about the closing circle and Barry Commoner. When he passed away, the New York Times obituary described Barry Commoner as a founder of modern ecology, a provocative thinker who made environmentalism a people's political cause. His 4 laws of ecology were emblazoned on T-shirts. Commoner felt that the United States was in an environmental crisis, and in contrast to many people of the time, the cause was not third world population growth, but consumer demand and production of unsustainable products, basically putting profits ahead of social good. That nature's ecological economy was the fount of true wealth, and man's economy was out of sync. He used many examples, but particularly pesticides, phosphate detergents, which were common at the time, leaded gasoline, and plastics that were designed to not degrade. He argued further that the planet's future depended on not making messes in the first place, and thought that payments to companies for cleaning up pollution were an anathema because it encouraged bad behavior in the first place. Scientists and engineers, like most of us in this room, had the expertise to address these issues and inform the public, but instead we were developing new products in spite of negative impact on the environment. In the latter part of his book, he put forward the concept of social thrift. He called for a remake of the US economy to make products that contribute to human welfare as opposed to profits. He estimated that the capital cost of this would be $1 trillion over many years. He said that this would preclude military investments, and it would diminish our affluent lifestyle, which he characterized by GNP, consumption of energy and metals, and it would eliminate wasteful production. But it would not diminish the availability of useful goods. Instead, by eliminating pollution, would improve the quality of life for everyone. Now, Kellogg and Commoner were both graduates of Columbia University, about the same age, and they were both natives of Brooklyn. As described in Kellogg's professional memoirs, a talk by Commoner awoke his nascent interest in environmentalism. Kellogg called him a compelling speaker with a compelling message, and he adopted Commoner's concepts of social thrift in a moderated form. The importance of the common good was paramount, and the usefulness of materials trumps profits. He gave several examples. He said that lead in storage batteries that we use in our automobiles was okay because it could be recycled, it provided a useful tool to humanity, but lead in paints and gasolines was not. It spread out all over the environment, it could not be recovered, and it probably had health effects. He did not particularly like, no, that's an understatement. He disliked aluminum cans because they consumed a lot of energy, they had a very low recycling rate at the time, and there were ever less damaging alternatives, for example, returnable bottles. He stated that pursuit of profits would be fine as long as there were societal benefits. And in an echo of Commoner, he said that we engineers have special responsibilities. We have to take the initiative in environmental battle, developing better technologies, and owing allegiance to broad societal good in place of interests of one company or industry. Now, let's talk about iron ore. Since 1970, we have mined 20 billion tons of iron ore. The average growth rate is 2.5%, but in two distinct time frames. Between 1970 and 2000, it grew at about 0.8%, and with the rise of China from 2000 to 2009, it grew at 7%. The limits to growth predicted an average growth rate of 1.8%. Now, if you look at the reserve data, the reserve data is taken from USGS publications, and during the 1979 to 86 period, the USGS did not report a reserve base rather than reserves, hence the data gap. But if we look at this, we can see that the static reserve index, that is the reserves divided by the production of that given year, has dropped from some 300 years to about 80 years today, still a substantial reserve considering that companies strive to maintain a 20-year reserve, and putting materials into reserve is expensive. In 1970, Kellogg provided a crude estimate of the energy consumed for production of raw steel at 29 megajoules per kilogram, and for steel products, a more accurate estimate of 36 megajoules per kilogram. 2013 numbers from Australia reported a consumption of 20 to 25 megajoules per kilogram, and the World Steel Association reports a 50% reduction in global energy consumption for steel over the period 1970 to 2020. Let's look at the reasons for these improvements. Well, first, in 1970, there were two main technologies for steel production. The first being the open hearth furnace, developed in 1865. It was a low-intensity reactor in which hot metal and scrap were heated and melted with fossil fuels, and the process time for a single heat varied from 9 to 12 hours. Invented in Austria and developed in Japan during the post-war years, the basic oxygen furnace was expanding globally and today is by far the dominant technology. An intense reactor involving tonnage oxygen, the BOF is autogenous, and the time required for single heat somewhere between a half to 1 hour, even in the 1970s. The energy consumed was a small fraction of that consumed by the open hearth furnace. Now, the USA had a surplus capacity of open hearth furnaces and was slow to adopt. And this slowness contributed to the loss of competitiveness of the US steel industry, which became obvious a decade later. What were the other steelmaking improvements? Process scale, plants got larger, output increasing from 0.6 million tons per year to 6 to 12, continuous casting, secondary refining and casting improving material properties, low capex, mini mills which upended the primary steel production and promoted scrap consumption. And the results of all of this are energy and cost savings, increased recycling, and due to better products, a 2x increase in the life of our automobiles. These are significant benefits in line with social thrift. The other invention of the time, important one, is the direct reduction of iron ore, which was only a dream in 1970. Today, it's a commercial reality, especially employed in countries rich in natural gas and poor in coal, and possibly direct reduction employing hydrogen provides a key to steel decarbonization, a subject of great concern today. Let's talk about copper. Copper consumption over the period grew at a 2.5% rate, but with less impact due to the rise of China. Copper reserves have been actually increasing in recent years, partly due to our ability to process lower grade ores, and the static reserve index has increased modestly. In 1973, the USA copper industry was in a crisis. Nationalization of mines and smelters in Chile had resulted in a financial chill. The smelters were energy hogs and large emitters of sulfur dioxide. Concentrate was smelted in low-intensity reverberatory furnaces shown on the left, fired by fossil fuels, and these generated exhaust gases that were too dilute for sulfuric acid manufacture. The Pierce-Smith converters were equipped with loose-fitting hoods and generated discontinuous dilute sulfur dioxide gas. The industry, the US industry, argued that even if they were to produce sulfuric acid, they didn't know how to do it, but even if they did know how to do it, there would be no local market for it because the transport to the markets was exceedingly expensive. They said that sulfuric acid product would have to be neutralized with lime and then the gypsum landfilled, both an economic and an environmental disaster. They studied many technical alternatives, how to modify the reverberatory furnace, how to make elemental sulfur, how to scrub the gases, but these were all ineffective. So we built super stacks to carry the gases above the inversion level to disperse the noxious gases. As we know from our experiences in Coppercliff, this helped the local environment but damaged the regional environment. Let's talk about how this was resolved. First, to replace the reverberatory furnaces, the Outokumpu flash furnace, a high-intensity reactor invented in Finland around 1950 and also developed in Japan, saved energy and generated high-strength gas suitable for acid manufacture. It became a semi-standard for the industry. In Canada, the Noranda reactor was developed. It has been copied globally and became a viable smelting alternative. In the 1980s and 1990s, bath smelting, as pioneered by Noranda, was reimagined as Ausmelt, Isosmelt technologies. The engineers and the construction people designed sophisticated tight-footing hoods for Pierce-Smith converters, and the process people got busy creating computer programs to schedule the converter operation to provide a continuous gas stream, or more or less continuous gas stream. Improved markets for sulfuric acid resulted due to the invention of leach solvent extraction and electrowinning of oxide ore. And in Japan, they began to construct smelters on tidewater in industrial clusters providing a market for the acid and waste heat. This model has been followed by Korea and China. Decreasing ore grade has been a challenge in the copper industry and will remain a challenge for the industry. To date, this has been dealt with primarily by increasing the scale of operations, as shown by the large mining truck here, and by flotation cells. The photograph on the left, bottom left, is from 1965, very small flotation cells, and today's flotation cells on the right. Here are energy calculations for copper processing. The increase in energy for mining and milling is predominantly due to the decreasing grades. The decreased energy consumption for smelting and refining is due to the replacement of old smelting technology with newer methods. Now, copper production is almost synonymous with electricity generation, transmission, and applications. Since 1998, about 2 billion additional people have received electricity. Electricity turns darkness into light. It enables people to read, learn, and write when they would not otherwise be. It liberates people, especially women, from the arduous task of hauling water. In my estimation, copper does more to develop the global South and promote equality for women than the other metals we are discussing. Social thrift benefits of our developments in copper processing technologies comprise energy, environmental, economic, and social dimensions. Okay, zinc. During the past half century, the consumption of zinc has grown at about 2%, lower than the 2.9% prediction from limits to growth. But zinc reserves have increased, but the static reserve index at 17 years is the lowest of any of the metals we're discussing. Today, 90% of the world's zinc is produced by hydrometallurgical processes, the main one being the roast-leach electrowind process. The 1970 USA was much different. Only 55% of production was by hydrometallurgy. The remainder by pyrometallurgy, including the Belgian horizontal retort process developed in 1790, which we're going to talk about in a little depth. The other pyrometallurgical processes were 20th century developments that could not compete on the basis of energy, environment, and product quality with the hydrometallurgical process. So today, since zinc pyrometallurgy is almost extinct, let's take a quick look at the process metallurgy. It depends on three thermochemical aspects of zinc. First, the relatively low melting points and boiling points of zinc, and also the fact that zinc is reducible by carbon at 900 degrees C. There were four main steps: the roasting of the sphalerite zinc sulfide to zinc oxide, high temperature carbon reduction, cooling to condense the zinc vapor, and refining. There were two refining processes: liquation to produce a 96% zinc product, and distillation to produce a 99.9% zinc product. Here are three views of the horizontal retort process. On the upper left-hand side, you will find my sketch from my 1973 notes, just to show you that I really do have them. Okay? You'll see that the retort was about 8 feet long, 10 to 18 inches in diameter, and in practice, a retort was charged with about 60 kilograms of feed to produce 30 kilograms of zinc at 85 to 90% recovery in a 24-hour cycle. Pretty small potatoes by our current standards. The lower left shows the retort equipped with a condenser in the heated furnace. It was indirect fired. And the photo shows a bank of zinc retorts. To achieve commercial scale, a large zinc plant might have 7,000 retorts in operation at the same time. The last horizontal zinc plant in the USA closed in 1976. Let's take a look at the zinc production process in a short video and the working conditions involved. And I'll advise you that if you are truly an ergonomist, you might want to avert your eyes. Could I have the video, please?
The film you're about to see is a record of the past because it was taken in this horizontal zinc distillation plant at Swansea, which was closed down in March 1960. 7 a.m. The maneuvermen start work. The daily cycle of operations begins with the morning scrape. That is the removal of the last amount of zinc from the condensers. Ravels are used to withdraw the metal into hand ladles. Retorts that have become defective during the process have to be replaced by new ones. The first step in changing retorts is the removal of residues from the defective retort. Then the surrounding clay is cut away. Tongs and a long pipe are used for the extraction of the retort from the furnace. Condensers are prized apart from the retorts by means of a steel bar. At 8:15 a.m. The condensers are transferred from the furnace front to a place on the furnace floor where they can be cleaned of all inside accretion. This accretion is afterwards added to the furnace charge. Starting at the bottom row, the men, using scoops, remove residues from the retorts. At 9:45 a.m. The charge is dumped onto the furnace floor. Because the protective screen had to be lifted to permit charging of the furnace, galvanized sheets are used to shield the men from the radiant heat. Special scoops are used for charging. At suitable intervals, the charge in the retorts is densified with a puncher. Condensers are luted to the retorts with clay. Great care has to be taken to make the joint between condenser and retort airtight. Luting is done with an iron tool having a crescent-shaped head. Before the tool is used, it has to be heated. 12:10 p.m. The reaction has proceeded to a certain degree, and gases issue from the nose of the condensers. They are ignited by the valveman. 4:20 p.m. Zinc dust from the prolongs is emptied into special collecting bins.
In the half-century since OSHA, many workplace hazards have been minimized or eliminated, at least in the global north. Earlier this year, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics published industry-wide data on occupational industries and injuries and illnesses during this period. The societal benefits from the OSHA-based initiatives are clear and really need little or no explanation. Okay, let's talk about lead. Process-wise, much of the world's lead is still produced by blast furnace smelting and really not particularly exciting. The big news about lead is shown in the world production levels. over the 50-year period we're talking about, lead consumption grew at an equivalent rate, not exponential, but equivalent rate of only 0.5%. The low rate of growth was due to the banning of lead in two of its major applications of the 70s, gasoline and interior paint. The lead paint story is provocative. It demonstrates that while our industry can create and has created positive social outcomes, it can also do great harm. As well, it shows what happens when one becomes devoted to profits, ignoring social concerns. The Romans recognized the hazards of lead. In a letter to a friend, Benjamin Franklin concluded that lead paint was poisonous. By 1904, lead had been linked to diseases in children, and by 1930, European countries had implemented bans and restrictions on lead. During this time, the International Lead Association started recording cases of lead poisoning in children, information that it kept confidential, but later became important in the writing of this book from 2012, which I highly recommend if you're interested. Continuing on, in the same time, the National Lead Corporation instituted an aggressive marketing campaign. It aimed a lot of its marketing at parents in an effort to reach parents through their children, because also saying that the children were their future customers. It created coloring books for children. They also highlighted the positive health effects of lead paint recommended for hospitals and convalescents. All this concerns about lead poisoning stayed out of the public domain until a 1943 Time magazine article, which was of the time. The International Lead Association conducted a campaign which claiming that these concerns were due to faulty research and misinformation. We've never heard that before. In the 1950s, doctors developed chelation therapy to create the worst cases of poisoning. New York City limited lead content in paint to less than 2%, and the Housing Commission said that lead paint should be labeled as poisonous, which it was forced to back down from. Activism and research in the 1960s and 70s by Black Panthers and social workers concerned about the city raised concerns about the city and the people, particularly poor African American children living in broken down housing, raised the issues, and groundbreaking research was conducted, aided by improved methods of chemical analyses. Courageous doctors and social workers probed the effects of very low levels of lead in children and advocated for stricter regulations. In 1978, lead in interior paints was banned in the USA and in Canada at about the same time. Today, the health impacts linger. There are approximately 30 million housing units in the USA with lead paint and impacting perhaps 3 million children, and there are proposals to have stricter regulations put in place. Okay, finally, our metal, aluminum, the metal with the highest growth rate, has been at 3.8% in the last 50 years, but lower than that projected by limits to growth. The static reserve index for lead today is about 80 years, so that we're not going to run out of it. There is only one commercial technology, the Bayer process, followed by the Hall-Heroult high-temperature electrochemical smelting. Now, the aluminum was a hot button for the 1970 environmentalists. Production and disposal of red mud was a concern, a problem persisting today. Smelter fluoride emissions, a problem that has been substantially reduced by installation of dry scrubbers and computer control to minimize the anode effect, which generated large amounts of fluorides. And the very high energy consumption of the time, driven both by thermochemistry requirements and the inefficiency in electrical energy generation. This has clearly decreased in the last half century, most probably due to improved control and computer algorithms. Also, there was a very low rate of recycling, about 5% of consumption, and this was especially concerning to the environmentalists because remelting of aluminum scrap required about 5% of the energy consumed in primary production. The aluminum can. To Kellogg, aluminum cans were an anathema, a very low recycling rate, high energy consumption, and there were alternatives. He was particularly galled by a Reynolds Metals campaign characterizing aluminum cans as an energy bank. We put our energy into these cans, and then we can get it back. The high value of discarded cans would provide financial incentives for recycling. Thus, the more you used, the better you are. Kellogg likened this to salting a gold mine. The aluminum industry had a good reason for promoting beverage cans. Aluminum in packaging was the only growth area in the United States for the next 20 years. In 2018, the Aluminum Association reported that the can recycling rate in the USA was 64%. The EPA calculated a 50% recycling rate, equivalent to 5% of the yearly aluminum consumption rate. And those numbers are clearly better, but probably not a great cigar. Let's take another look at the recycling of aluminum from a different perspective, the amount of aluminum reporting to landfill. In 2018, it's estimated 2.4 million tons of aluminum were sent to landfill, or about 20% of apparent consumption. The EPA also reported values for steel, 10% of consumption going to landfill, and interestingly, the recycling rate of steel cans is higher than that of aluminum cans. And they reported 670,000 tons of non-ferrous metals to landfill, which if we calculate on the basis of copper, lead, zinc consumption is about 14%. So recycling rates have increased, but large amounts of metal are wasted each year. Okay, so what have we achieved in half a century? Well, it's certainly not a steady state economy. In fact, economic growth is good. Ask any CEO of a large company what happens when the company does not meet its growth targets. Barry Commoner's concept of social thrift has not been realized, nor the more modest proposals of Kellogg's. Profits still rule, and we love our affluent lifestyle, which requires material and energy resources. As well, GDP is equivalent to economic well-being, and obtaining high levels of per capita GDP depends on high energy consumption. Here is the relationship from 1970, when energy consumption is expressed as kilograms of coal per person per year, plotted against per capita GDP, and today we express it as kilowatt hours per capita, but the trend is the same. But let's celebrate our achievements, which are notable. We've provided a reliable supply of refined metals with lower pollution generation and lower energy consumption. We have minimized the hazards presenting a clear and present danger: SO2 emissions, lead in paint and gasoline, and unsafe working conditions. But on other issues that were highlighted even a half century ago, we have had inertia, issues that seem to be less threatening. Aluminum and other metal recycling, design for longevity and recycling. We have a very low recycling rate of plastics, and now we're finding plastics in many species of fish and animals, including humans, and anthropomorphic climate change. The flag was first raised by James Hansen in 1988. Since then, we've had the Kyoto Protocols. We've had, I can't read that. Oh, The Inconvenient Truth from Al Gore, and we've had repeated IPCC reports that each time get more and more concerning. And climate change is now viewed as an existential challenge. We are living in a carbon-constrained world. And this is not business as usual or continuous improvement. These are transformational step changes which require a major restructuring of the energy and resource industry, requiring full effort. Electric cars, decarbonizing steel production. It's estimated that this will require many terawatt hours of energy. Last year at this conference, my former colleague at Inco and Valley, Ashok Dalvi, presented an interesting paper which he talked about the capital cost for decarbonization. $728 billion, and excluding the capex for hydrogen generation and electricity, and this is only for a 50% reduction. And the International Electricity Association recommends that Energy Association recommends that we will need to increase our critical mineral supply by 6 times by 2040, with Canada having expected to concentrate on lithium, nickel, cobalt, copper, and rare earth elements. So should we consider the tenets of social thrift again? The social and environmental activism of the half century ago changed how we view ourselves, with nature, how we view our work. The USA was in an environmental and economic crisis, and it put great thought into how to deal with this. Are we today approaching this in our own lives as a business as usual mentality? Energy is the elephant in the room, and let's consider that we treat this as a crisis. Should we be using clean energy in the north for producing aluminum cans or mining Bitcoin, or bring electrical superhighways to the south where the people are and it can do more difference? Should we consider restrictions on materials and energy use similar to World War II rationing? Should we consider redirecting our scarce human and mechanical mining resources for commodities most needed? And finally, our next presentation, my colleague Peter will talk about whether a balanced economy is possible and how the economy has changed in the last 50 years, affecting our ability to reach net zero.
Well, now that Sam has given you the chirpier version of the issues raised by Commoner, I'll give you some perspective from the so-called dismal science of economics. I also very much aware that what stands between you and the bar. Most people would sooner stick needles in their eyes than at least listen to an economist. When I'm done, I may have validated the view of economics as the dismal science. It may not get you to a drink sooner, but it may cause you to drink more by the time I'm done. And if we run out of things, as a former chief economist of the government, I used to set your taxes. So if you're short on other issues, you can bring that in. There are three things that I really want to talk about. There's going to be some overlap between Sam and I, so maybe a couple of slides I go quickly on. There are three issues that I want to talk about. Sam has given you the background and the frame and the social concerns, environmental concerns that Commenter had. Number one, I will talk a bit about the economics of the day in Commenter's time, as well as the economic policy frame at that time. Secondly, I'll talk about the economics today and the economic policy frame that will confront us addressing the range of issues that Commenter talked about. And thirdly, because my particular interest is in the economics of industrial organization, I will zero in on one particular aspect, which is Commenter, validly at the time, looked at achieving these through the instrument of the mining company as an integrated vertical industrial corporation. That's gone. In the day, that meant, in his time, INCO, and for Canadians, INCO, Noranda, Cominco, etc. That's all gone away. So I am going to talk about, somewhat provocatively perhaps, what might the mining company of the future look like in general, but also to address this range of environmental, social, and economic concerns. And finally, because words matter, well, maybe they don't matter to Trump, but words matter. So my observation, then the whole mining dialogue in this public sphere has been taken over by the critical minerals thrust. Both it dominates media, dominates government policy, government allocation of money, and the potential risks in that taking over the whole mining space. So those are the three areas I want to cover, and I'll try to do that fairly quickly. So first, to be clear, I do not take issue at all with Commenter's objectives and his overall policy views. But much has changed in our views of the role of government that was assumed in his framework. The somewhat, in my view, perverse version of social thrift that we've had unfold. And the problematic of always equating economic well-being with GDP growth. So just to review very briefly, the issues, oh, I'm sorry. I don't know how to back it up. Commenter's economics, first of all. I have no issue of his four laws of ecology as Sam had described them before. However, the economy to which those policies apply has changed qualitatively, and that's mostly what I want to talk about. At the heart of Commenter's economics was a constraint of consumption. That is, if you like, the American way of life and the threat that had for resource consumption and the need to constrain it. When the reality since then, in the OECD countries, there has been a kind of social constraint, but it's been through inequality more than anything. But also in a global sense, the rise of China and other middle-income countries has more, I think Commenter today would look at that as how the second bounce, if you like, of that unfolded in ways that he did not expect at the time. So, as I say, and Sam alluded to, we're still looking for a social balance. My version of looking at that is one social balance at its core, more than any other single thing, is around the distribution of income. Secondly, the corporation, not on his thing, the rebalancing of the corporation. And I think in that respect, we have to look at this question of the impact of the revolution of shareholder values management philosophy and ideology as espoused by Jack Welch at General Electric. And finally, just by way of international financial stabilities, not probably on most people's radar screen, but the industry, the mining industry, has had chronic issues of boom and bust. And therefore, actually, on your radar screen should be some consideration of the architecture of international finance. You may not spend a lot of time on the World Bank or the IMF, but it actually has an impact on the moderation or acceleration of the boom and bust economy. That's why I think it's important to talk about it today. So, social thrift by other means, that is the growth of inequality. Reacting as he was in the 1970s, we had seen incredible explosion of material wealth in the Industrial Revolution, but also the redistribution of that over time. That is, between 1770 and 1870, global production for the first time exceeded $3 per capita. And that raised the issue of how would that be distributed. Well, in the economic growth period, between 1870 and 2010, growth accelerates from 0.45 per year to 2.1. And over time, that has tremendous consequences. In terms of income, it meant an 8-time increase in income. So that's what gets you in part to the level of consumption and also distribution. So by those measures, Commenter might look at the 1970s as a worker's utopia in terms of wages compared to the past. If we look at that, what really happened was the workers' shares of productivity. The post-war boom between 1945 and 1975 saw workers' wages and productivity march in lockstep. What has really changed in the ensuing period of time is workers' wage gains became disembedded from the productivity development, and that was the major gap. We also had a shrinking middle class. That is, in America, a middle class income by 2007 was $17,800 lower than if the previous trajectory had been continued. Another look at it, the 1% versus the 1% of the income versus the others, huge gains compared to the median income. Also, the middle versus the bottom. The major wage gains were at the top end of the wage scale, and the lowest group fell further behind. Though, ironically, post-COVID, the first time in 75 years, the lowest occupational groups gained the most. That has something to do with COVID and service industries and catch-ups in wages, but it's the first time in 75 years that the lowest group came up. So, but the whole business of social thrift depended on a certain role of the state. It really emerged out of Keynesianism and the welfare state post-1945, but government is the equilibrium balance mechanism to maintain the social and economic balance. It's ironic because Commenter publishes his book in 1973, 1978, Margaret Thatcher is elected, and then subsequently Reagan is elected in the United States. What happens in substantive terms is that private financial markets become the equilibrium mechanism instead of the role of government. That was fought out, and that side of the argument won. So we had a 40-year run of that neoliberal economy where it was private markets rather than the government. That started to unravel certainly by the financial crisis of 07, 08, and certainly post-COVID. We now have this large debate about the role of government, but the previous period is over. Martin Wolf of the Financial Times recently published The Variability, i.e. the economic argument that Thatcher and Reagan wanted to make was rather than government, private financial markets would give us growth and stability. I want to argue it has given us neither. And we're now in a period of trying to rethink all of that. So that's the first aspect. The other thing is a corporate environment. That is the rise of the ideology of shareholder value under the leadership of Jack Welch. My own view is, for working people, particularly industrial workers, it was the revolution of shareholder value by Jack Welch that was made more disequilibrating than either the overall policies of Thatcher or Reagan. This was the one that starts to change all of the industrial corporations, including the mining industry. So Jack Welch comes into GE. GE is one of the great corporations in the history of America, looked around the world as a leader in success in management, R&D, product development, how they treated their workforce. Basically, the Welsh Revolution was to, in fact, destroy the workforce. It's not just workers on the line, it was engineers, but also ultimately GE, just that followed the stock exchange, he destroys the company. So the management model of shareholder value becomes the new standard in the USA and also globally, and what economists now call the financialization of the economy. And it worked. If you looked at wages, return to workers' wages versus investors, it goes off the chart in the period, that period of time. And even more closely, in 1968, the CEO of General Motors earned 20 times what an auto worker made on the assembly line. By the last decade, it was 300 times. So the impact of that the only obligation of the corporation was to its shareholders, nothing to its employers, to customers and communities. But the impact on the organization, it affects mining companies as well as others. It was short-termism, the next quarter's financial results. When the corporation started spending multiples, if you start spending 4 or 5 times for stock buybacks that you do on R&D, you get a certain kind of industrial and economic and technological performance. And that's what has happened. Now, maybe it's changing. 2022, Apple, having spent around $700 billion on stock buybacks, decides they better start reinvesting in the company and their people, their products, and technology development. So we may be at a turning point there. I want to talk about the unbundling of the mining corporation, which is, again, gets to the industrial organization that I most specialize on. That is, what has happened is, my view, the mining corporation now is primarily, it moves from integrated management of the corporation as an integrated entity to a management of a management of a series of assets. They manage ore bodies, if you like. Secondly, the most largest activity is multi-party project management, the development of mines and expansion of them. And thirdly, I think over time, and this starts to echo the social environmental concerns, is I think we're trying to move from shareholder value to stakeholder capitalism, as it's called in business schools, as a direction for the future. I'll come back to that. So, as I said, for Commoner, the industrial corporation, the Incos of the day, the Nuras, his analysis applied to that vertically integrated organization. It's no more. As I said, they help portfolios and they contract for services and supply chains. But one of the things is on project management, as Sam has published work in other areas, the execution of projects has hugely stretched over time. And part of that is just straight management, part of it is a permitting system, et cetera. But Sam has contrasted particularly in the Inco Valley case, PT Inco versus Goro, where you go from months to decades in developing projects. And as John Steen from UBC says, that's an activity and a skill set that's very different than the classical industrial, vertically integrated industrial organization. It's not the sort of thing that mining companies are good at, even though at the philosophical level they've changed. So what does that mean? One, at the center of the old business model, one that's changed and will need to be changed, you had the operating company at the center of the core, had to deal with government around royalties, taxes, as permits, and they had certain benefits to the community, but the operating company was at the center. It had suppliers, but it was the core of the whole structure. I think in future, we're going to be looking at something like this. That is on, I guess it's the left-hand side of the screen. You'll have mining as a service. You'll have a set of services by remote and local suppliers, but the mining will essentially be a service company. I think that's the road we're onto. In the center, formerly occupied by an operating company, you'll have basically a mineral rights organization. That would be government, operating companies as partners, and the community. And if you look at the distribution of the ore bodies in rare critical minerals in Canada, that means the native communities not as bystanders, but active things. So the shape of this is, I think, my intuition is that's what the mining company is going to look like in the future. It will be something like that. As I said, you'll have a service company, an operating company that's largely basically a service company. In the center, you'll have a different kind of governance and activity around a mineral rights organization, and then you'll have the interaction with products and buyers. So briefly, I want to, because it's not on the radar screen of most folks when they think about economics and mining, the imbalance in the global economy. That is, we've had, you see lots of commentary this day about the international post-war system, a rules-based system. That is the network, the famous Bretton Woods conference in 1944 with the IMF, the World Bank, the GATT, et cetera, and the, quote, post-war settlement. That's actually not quite true. What really we had at Bretton Woods in particular, the wartime powers imposing their terms on the rest. And from China to India to others, they're now saying the rest, if there's a new architecture, the rest have to be in this movie. And it's not, you can't just smooth that over, saying it was a generalized post-war settlement. The reserve currency for the global economy, Keynes proposed a reserve currency that would be a intergovernmental, a fiat currency, he called it Bancor. And he was defeated in that argument by Harry Dexter White, and the other Americans said, no, it's going to be the US dollar linked to gold. It takes a long time to put these things in place. That system only lasted 13 years. It was only fully in place by 1958, and 1971, when Nixon goes off the gold standard, that system, as I said, for all the famous and rhetorical support for it, only lasted 13 years. And it's interesting for today, that period coming off the gold standards was the last time we had a massive global wave of inflation that sort of approximates what we've seen in the last 2 years. To stabilize the system, it became transferred from the American gold standard to the role of central banks, and particularly using interest rates and interest rate targeting to control inflation. And that is the capacity of the system we've sort of patched together, and it's now being sorely tested. So the early warning signs were there in the early 70s. The end of convertibility of US dollars, the explosion of oil prices, and a call for, at that time, a new international economic order, of which we're now hearing, in the name of resource nationalism, a new version of that same argument. What's next? Well, there's three teams on the field right now. One is, do we have a neo-Mercantilism, that is America first and then the others following? So, or do you have autocracy, everyone for themselves? Or thirdly, which is my best guess, economic regionalism, That is, the peak of globalization is probably over. There's statistical arguments that it was over by 2010. But you'll have regionally integrated trade blocs. That's the shape of the system that we're going forward to, in my view. There is calls for the famous international economist, Canadian Heliner, that a new Bretton Woods system. This global economy can't function without a reserve currency. I think that's basic proposition. What's called in the trade an embedded liberalism. Jake Sullivan, the U.S. National Security Advisor, gave a major speech about 8 weeks ago on how they're trying to reinstitutionalize the multilateralism for a new, quote, open world economy, and using public management for prosperity, some of those Keynesian aspects. Well, the level of political difference and polarization we have, I think lots of luck on that one. My own view on one of the things I think is important, this stabilization, we are going to have a need badly a new fiat, a new global currency. It was probably going to take us for 10 years to get there. And until we can put that together, we're going to have 10 to 15 years of instability and uncertainty. And for this industry that is particularly subject to booms and busts, that is an increased level of risk. Oops, sorry. So let me turn to a new mining narrative, which is my last section of what I'll talk to you about. The circular economy, I believe, is a critical policy frame. It certainly was absolutely central for Commoner. I think that will be important, but not the leading organizational principle if we try to take Commoner's framework and apply it to our own day. Well, we've witnessed, somewhat to surprise to me, maybe to you, how the critical minerals narrative has completely taken over the mining space. And that will be the leading theme, because words matter, under the theme of the energy transition. And I want to suggest a couple of points on how that may provide real challenges, changes, and risks for the mining industry. But before that, I just wanted to make a point. It's awkward in the slides. There are new methodologies in economics. Economists do learn things that were not available to Commoner. What I sorry, I got the slides wrong? Oh, sorry. Yes, sorry, thanks, Sam. Material flow analysis, I think, is uniquely important as a methodology, because it allows us to look at production, particularly these challenges, any one of the 20 different competing estimates of the future mining is, but it allows us to do it in a holistic way, if you like, a more circular economy way, particularly the ability to calculate recycling potentials. I'm particularly taken with the Fraunhofer copper flow analysis. All I'm suggesting here is if you look underneath the model, the recycling becomes the balancing. It's a balancing equation for the rest of it. Early innings on this day, but I think to get to the kind of methodology that would have better served Commoner's purposes, material flow analysis will be very important going forward. So, measuring success. As I said, Commoner highlighted social thrift and the circular economy. I think, just because economists spend a lot of time thinking about units of measure, I think Kellogg and his energy consumption unit of measure will be more relevant to what we try to do going forward from where we are than how Commoner phrased it. So, but could we have a surprise ending in all of this? And this would be my concluding things. One, as I mentioned, the whole economic and resource development narrative in Canada in particular has been taken over by critical minerals. And if you follow the money, government subsidies have overcome the critical shortages in capital investments. Billions have been flowing into exploration, development, infrastructure, etc. In fact, by any measure, if you believe any one of those forward projections on the demand for the minerals, the industry is not investing anywhere near what it needs to meet that demand. So will this be a major leap forward for mining and metallurgy? I would say, as a former chief economist, beware what you ask for. I.e., the mining becomes a transitory industry. It no longer is a standalone industry. It becomes and it loses its autonomy. That is, mining becomes a transitory industry subordinate to the energy transition. That's the dominant narrative. That's where the money is going. And if you believe in following the money, that's what the future looks like. What's a transitory industry? Transitory industry, because it will revolutionize, the energy transition will revolutionize the way energy is generated, stored, and transferred with widespread effects on industries and households. It may mean the role from the mining industry and metallurgy is not a great leap up. It's actually what I would call a modest role for mining. That is, the mining industry is mature and predates the technological revolution related with the green technology and the green economy. It no longer is, if it ever was, a leader of technological change in and of itself. But at the same time, mining is essential for the making of that core energy transition. And the broader technological revolution in the energy transition requires a facilitator industry to be upgraded to take on that task, but in a secondary role. So my conclusion is that for all of the hype of the transition and the importance of critical minerals, it could be, because the industry has not stepped up with the level of capital investment, the governments are flooding billions of dollars out. It could be that this is a transition point for the industry, but it'd be a transition point to being a subsidiary feeder of the energy industry, not as historically known the mining as an autonomous industry in and of itself. Thank you for your time.
I believe we have a few minutes that we can take some questions or questions, responses, if there are any from the audience. Now, there's some people, there's some microphones scattered throughout the audience. No questions, no comments? We've answered all the questions, or we put everyone to sleep? Elvie, yes.
Elvie Dalgard, Pratt & Whitney, Canada. You mentioned that there's a chance that the mining and metallurgy industries will no longer be autonomous. How does that tie in with social thrift? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I mean, leaving aside our personal considerations and desires to be an autonomous industry, perhaps that's a good thing for society?
Is this a... Yeah, that's okay. First of all, I think in terms of the finances and the economics and the technology of the industry, this transitory thing is, the potential is, that's the track we actually go down. In terms of the social licensing, et cetera, and all of that social engagement, I think what I've recommended in a very initial way, that scheme of how the business model of mining in particular has to change because of the nature of resource development. That's a sketch of the future. But the overlapping thing, which the energy transition itself will have, about its social legitimacy, the engagement of various social groups, et cetera, will fall under that umbrella. So the energy industry already wears it. That's social legitimacy issue. I think we're going to come under that. If there was any doubt at all, I don't think there should be, it will come under that umbrella.
Okay. So not necessarily a disaster then. It's not
I'm
a
sorry?
disaster that we're
No.
becoming less autonomous.
I
It's progress.
Well, it can be progress. I come out of the steel industry, and the Stelcos of the day believed they were an empire in itself. To some degree, that got knocked out of them 40 years ago. No, it is not a recipe for a disaster. One, it's a recommendation for a fundamental change in business organization and culture. Two, it will mean that we will only be able to do business if we do it in a different way. That's a little amateur sketch of how we will have to do that business differently.
Okay. Thank you.
See a question in the middle?
Thanks, Sam and
Javier.
Peter. I had a question. A lot of these initiatives and leadership has to come from governments. I think that was what you talked about in the past, Sam, and also in the future with these three models for the future. Any ideas or clues about how to get an international consensus with all of the governments so that the world can act as in union rather than individual actions that are sometimes contradictory?
Well, it won't succeed without action at that level. I'll get the name wrong for the moment, but there's already an international council that doesn't have governance status, of council of a code of conduct. I think that's an important step in the way. We're going to need much more on that, because if you just read your newspaper, we're heading back into another iteration of what economists called resource nationalism. And it's usually fought out in terms of jobs in the mine and what the royalties are. There's a much bigger discussion we can have around that. But
Thanks very much.
I think it's vital.
Hello, Peter.
Yes, Philip?
Sam, my name is Philip. I agree with your background and analysis and the transitory nature that will come, but wouldn't you agree that there's no energy transition without metals? In other words, metals will be essential. We don't know if that transitory concept will stick, but metals will always be needed for this so-called energy transition.
Not only needed, but more of them will be needed. I mean, I lead a group at the Vatican on the future of mining, and the ethical paradox we have is we cannot get to a low-carbon economy with a certain amount of minerals and metals. And that's, how are we going to do that in a way that's socially and environmentally sustainable? That's what my colleagues in the Vatican are noodling on.
We have a question over here. Oh, okay, you over here first, yes.
Yeah. Hi, this is Gerardo from Canadian Engineering. I want to talk or touch bases on the last point you mentioned about the equity and the social part. I just watched a TV commercial 8 years ago in Germany when I was living there. There was this lady in Africa in a very small, not even considered a house, crying because she couldn't attend the birth of her grandchild. But suddenly from inside this little house came out the other daughter with an iPad and said, you can have an iPad and you can have a membership of whatever company, and look, you are talking to your daughter now, don't cry anymore. So what's the moral of the story? Is that if you are not part of that new economy, you will be suffering. You will not see your granddaughter being born in a hospital 500 km away. And when you just mentioned before the fact that the development need to reach everyone, and we are across this nationalism that is coming again. But when one part of the world doesn't see the benefit of the green economy, why I should worry about giving the medals? Could be, a way to think about this from countries that they don't have the same amount of welfare that we do have in places like Canada or Japan or Australia. How do you see that from the economy point of view? maybe you are familiar with Manfred Magniff, who was an economist who developed human scale development hypothesis back in the 90s, but he make a distinction between satisfactors of the needs and needs. That's my comment, if you can do something about it. Thank you.
Well, certainly, I agree. Playing the narrow-minded economist for the moment, most of the debates that take place, particularly in Africa, Latin America, et cetera, are about the jobs in the mine and the royalties. I think there's much broader issues. I mean, mining is developing like manufacturing, advanced manufacturing. Most of the jobs are in the supply chain. So just to say how many jobs in the mine and the immediate royalties is too narrow a focus on that. I think it just happens to be the reality that extractive industries wear the social legitimacy issue right square in the face. Now, we understand now why things like AI needs to have a social legitimacy, but it just happens to be mining and extractive industries as a whole wear this issue much more frontally. But Sam, you should do it.
I'm going to ask the next person the question. Yes.
Hey there. I'm Jael from Hatch. First of all, thank you for the awesome presentations. Very insightful and a little bit scary, to be honest. Some of the comments you made. But at the end of the day, I'm kind of curious of the new operating model that you presented for the mine. I saw that, well, how communities were interacting with the government as a regulatory body. How do you envision this collaboration to occur? And at the end of the day, which communities are going to be consulted? Because at least, I don't know, what I see, some trends are large urbanization, where there is like many people just want to move to the city. People are going to be concentrated in them. And most of the times, of course, mines are remote in the sense that they're located all around the world. And it used to be that mines, in a sense, were a source or originators of communities, in the sense that they found the ore body, they built a mine, and they sponsor the development of the community. But in this new model, how do you envision, or which communities are going to be participating in it? How are they going to be consulted? And at the end of the day, how are they collaborating with the government? Thank you.
This is as simple as your taxes. Well, you begin with the fact, if I'm even close to being right on what I'm framing as the MRO, the Mineral Rights Organization, that is going to be an actual partnership. It's not going to be sufficient to sign a royalty agreement, and that's it. So the operating company is going to be a partner with governments and local communities. The challenge will be to figure out how that governance model will work. All right? Companies are trying that. I'm impressed by Dundee's and what they've tried to do in their operations. So that's one part of it. But secondly, the jobs are absolutely important. But I have a set of slides I give to my students. Slide one said, okay, we talked about all these minerals, where are they? Mineral economics begins with where are the ore bodies? And then I overlay that with a slide that here's where the indigenous communities are. And third slide is where are their watersheds? Because water is the most contentious and difficult of the environmental challenges in mining. You start there.
Joel.
Yes, good evening. Thank you for your presentation. I need your help, Sam. Last year, during one of the panels, I labeled myself a slacker.
And you'll have to speak up a bit.
Okay.
You labeled yourself a disciple. Okay, a disciple of what?
I labeled myself as a slacker for the environment. And the reason for that, I was concerned about challenging myself about the fact that my generation, we either created or tolerated the environmental problems of the time. How can we talk to the new generation and help the new generation in our profession to do better than we did?
Okay, from one who came up in the 60s and 70s when Peter was protesting, I was a scientist engineering nerd who never protested, but got convinced by the activism and the publicity of the time that this is something I wanted to be involved in the way that my talents could be applied. And I think the messages from Barry Commoner, and in my case Herb Kellogg, that this is part of your job was a great deal of my involvement. And I think the answer to your question is this needs to be coming from the academic circles who teach not only the technical aspects of metallurgy, which are key and necessary, but that there's a social aspect, an environmental aspect that you also have to be accountable for. And societies like the Metallurgical Society have to do their part as well.
Thank you, that's a great answer. And also teaching political engagement, I guess, to change what government do and what we do.
Okay. Yes, I think we're a bit behind, but nobody's rioting yet. One more question from the middle.
Yeah, hi, thanks very much. Cameron Harris from Canadian Engineering. We're popular today, our company. You're saying we're transitioning towards something where we're going to have a government-community interaction between them at the centre with mining as a service industry. That's interesting, but what I don't really believe is you've got the banks of the world having their influence on the governments, the banks having their influence on the operating companies, and that whole chain is under the influence of the bank. And if you superimpose them as the top line there, their influence on government and the operating companies, and the trade-off between the influence of the general population on the governments, do you think the voice of the banks and their desire for returns and maximising shareholder value in the long term will have as much effect or possibly retain control to a great deal as they have today in the future as well?
Well, I'm not a stock picker, but I would not be investing a big part of my portfolio in banks in the next 10 years. One, they're pressurized by cryptocurrencies, wherever that finally leads. And secondly, they, if you have a reserve currency, as I think you do need to have a reserve currency for this global economy to work, that moves the banks, the private banks, into second place.
So is that Bitcoin? Thanks, Pete.
But Cam, in recent years, hasn't the movement toward socially conscious investing and the banks are leading and pushing companies to be environmentally responsible and have social aspects of it? I'm not sure that the banks are the dull edge of the wedge or the sharp edge of the wedge.
If you look at that whole segment of investment, you'll see that it's still a very tiny proportion of their total portfolio and one of the worst performing sections of the portfolio. So yeah, there's a lot of great PR there. There's a lot of greenwashing around it. But if you actually look at the size of that, it's not doing that well.
But we're in the early innings of this ESG stuff.
True.
It's a big deal. And God help us, it's the accountants, not even the economists, are going to have an important role to play in that.
Okay, I think, Rod, yes, okay. Well, you're getting in there right at the last minute, Rod.
Speaking as an academic, we do inform the students that there's more to it than just pulling the metal out of the ground and producing it. There are other aspects, and we are the academics in this room are busy doing that as well. But I think one thing you've all missed is that the politicians, you say the politicians in the various countries or government is controlling in the future what's going to happen to the mining industry. And the politicians, as we all know, are at sixes and sevens with each other all over the world. And it's a total mess. So what's this government that's going to make it happen until we get world government?
I don't think any group has a unique claim to corruption, you know. But in fact, just like, the response to the chap over here, the mining industry has been perceived as the problem in the environmental problem. There's no solution to the environmental problem without the mining industry. And, because things go round, there is no way we can deal with the mining industry being able to make that contribution without serious changes to the permitting system. Biggest single barrier for us going forward is not the technology, not even the money. It's actually the permitting system.
Okay, Wilkie?
Well, what thought-provoking talks to kickstart our conference on the theme of climate change and sustainability. So thank you both, Sam and Peter, for your valuable time in doing this talk.